I wanted to talk about housing in Vienna, which is often lauded as this pinnacle of housing policy, especially by people on the left, I would say, where the Socialist Party in Vienna, long time ago, started offering public housing at a scale that most other cities just do not have available, and public housing without the intention of it being for low-income people specifically. Public housing for everybody. Not the only city in the world to do this, but now their rental market is a little over 50% public housing. And that splits into two groups, basically. The way the rental market breaks down is there's normal private rentals, and then there is public, like fully socialized housing that the government offers. And then there's this thing called semi-public housing, which is basically housing that was previously owned by some sort of private company or person that was bought out by the government and operates a little differently from normal public housing. What this has done, or a success of this policy, is that Vienna, compared to all the other big Western cities in Europe, in Western Europe, has a very low average rental price for a one-bedroom apartment. It's a lot cheaper than places like London, like Amsterdam, like Madrid, and Vienna is used as an example of really successful housing policy because of this. And in preparation for talking about this, I spoke to a couple friends that live in Vienna and got their breakdown and like perspective of how this actually functions. And then also, generally just did research on this topic. Sure. But the idea is that because so much of the housing offered is publicly owned and not run with the profit incentive in mind, and because it takes up so much of the market, the remaining private sector of the market, which is allowed to exist, has to compete with the public housing available. And they continue to build public housing now. And the share of public housing over time has remained pretty consistent. It's shifted a little more private in recent years, but the split between the two public options and the private options has remained pretty even for a long time. And when you look at other cities with cost of living or housing crises, a good example is Vancouver. They've introduced public housing projects like this before. But the issue is that when you're starting from square one and very little of your housing is public to begin with, any nice building that you offer up at a way lower price than market that is equal quality to the rest of the housing being built, well, it's going to be snatched up right away. A bunch of people are going to apply and get those slots immediately, right? And you don't really solve the problem in the rest of the market with the rest of the market's housing being expensive, because you need enough control over the market and enough available units to compete against the private ones to be able to suppress the price. And they have managed to do this super successfully for a long time. The Socialist Party that introduced this policy is under fire more recently for something related to this, but has been in power in Vienna for a long time, and they were who introduced this policy. I also want to add that talking to one of my friends, you know how it branches down into three different types of housing, basically: public, semi-public, private. He said there's a secret fourth option that a lot of people go with.
Like an In-N-Out secret item menu.
I was intrigued, and I said, you get the house animal style.
They covered in chili.
and then they knock $200 off your rent. But he said that the other common way a lot of people get cheap rentals in Vienna is just by knowing people. And he said your homey way into private renting is actually the cheapest option of them all. And he listed off himself, his girlfriend, and a bunch of other people he knew as examples of, I just met someone through a friend or through a family member and then got my rental through them. And then because we could dodge all the agency and paperwork aspect of all of the other options, but specifically the private option, you could get the place at a way lower price, and you're way less likely to be gouged. So there was this secret like fourth private option where you avoid all the paperwork. And also interesting is prices have actually started to climb at a way higher rate in the last couple years. And the reasoning, as explained to me, was they have these agencies that sell or introduce people to homes. So these private agencies, if you're looking for private housing, will they'll be the guiding light to like finding you an apartment in Vienna, give you like private options that you could potentially rent, right? And that process apparently takes a long time, which is one of the reasons why you might try to find your homie option instead, because it's just more straightforward. But the prices of that, you paid the agency a fee as the person looking for an apartment. You pay them a fee to like help you find a place to stay. That fee 2-3 years ago, a policy was passed that fee onto the landlords. And this is the policy that has backfired on the Socialist Party that has the largest share of seats in Vienna, where the agencies and the landlords have basically started colluding because they can privately negotiate what this price is and then tack it onto the rent after with no interaction from the renters, has started raising average rental prices at a way higher rate than they ever have in past years. There's a couple other reasons why rents have gone up as well, but this policy has totally backfired because of the ways the agencies and the landlords have been able to gouge that specific fee out of people looking for private rentals. This just gives you a little like landscape of what housing is like. I can answer like more specific questions if you have them, but because of the time we have left, I know you had specific pushback to.
You were saying you don't want people to have affordable housing.
That's
You did say that.
I was saying that off pod, and I want to say it on pod because I'm in the villain chair. I don't think people should be able to live. Can I pull this up?
Yeah.
No, listen.
But if I were here, I'll give a synthesized kind of because, like I said, there's a lot of details that I dug into with both the people I interviewed and the research into this topic. But the synthesized point I want to make here is because we could say that because of this city's approach to housing and the amount of public housing that competes against the private market, and important to note, they've kept building public housing along the way. So you can't just like have a static, quantity and then not do anything about it after. That competition from the public option that has no profit incentive is a huge part of what has kept rents low and in control in Vienna for a long, long time. So I'm curious what you guys have to say about it.
So what I want to say is I'm going to go slightly free market bro on this one.
Yeah.
Villain!
Yes.
Villain!
I'm gonna go slightly, and this is one area, like, I've talked about this before. Like, I'll watch a Bernie Sanders speech. I fucking love the guy. I'm cheering for him. And then he says something about rent control. And I'm like, because I've lived through, I've had a rent control apartment. I've seen the experience firsthand. I've seen apartments without it. I've looked into it a lot. And over what I've found, to me, it feels like a kink in the hose of supply and demand that causes pain to a lot of people outside of it. A few people benefit, but a lot of people are hurt. And this is sort of somewhat in that. So I want to try to explain. I hear Vienna brought up a lot. And just to overview what happened, I think you said this pretty well, but the idea is, Vienna was the capital of Austria-Hungary, a big populous city, had 2.3.
Good day, mate. Strip on the Barbie.
He gets it.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Quarter of the world.
Had 2.3 million people in 1916. Obviously, Austria-Hungary had a problem in 2 different wars. Pretty bad problem. Things went to shit. Country got devastated.
People
Vienna
were turned into Vienna sausages.
Yes, exactly. And so we flash forward 100 years later, and they are at about the same level of population, 2 million. So again, a housing problem is much easier to solve when your population barely grows or barely changes in 100 years. When it's mostly flat, the problems that you might have in like a SF Bay Area where a lot of people are trying to get in at once aren't as apparent. What they did was, that I think deserves commendation, is not whether the house was socialized, whether the house was rent controlled, it's that they built fucking houses. They built a lot of them. That was when you really look into this policy, the thing that differentiates it from other cities is that they said every time we add a new block or a new area, we're going to set aside some area that has to be used for building housing. And it has to be dense housing, dense socialized housing. So whether that housing is socialized or not, it is zoned for dense, affordable housing. So it gets built. Mm-hmm. In actuality, so I did some research for this, and I wanted to see what to your credit, like, I didn't expect you to bring up so many points from people that live there, the good and the bad.
Yeah.
So I don't need to bring all this up, but I wanted to look at what actual people that live in Vienna are saying. And I tried to find comments that people are very positive on the city, except for a certain thing about rent. So I brought a couple of them up. This guy has a ton list of pros. He loves the city, but he mentions that cheap housing is kind of a lie. there's a lot of public housing, but to qualify at all, you need to have lived 2 years in Vienna. I think you know this as well, right?
Yeah.
You can't get it if you haven't been there 2 years. So if you're a new student that moves to Vienna, your options are only private housing. And actually, the private housing is rather expensive. It's actually gotten to the level of like Berlin and other major cities. So if you're there for 2 years, you can apply to get on a list to wait in a waiting line to get one of the socialized housing. But there's a difference between the good socialized housing and some of the more not as good. And generally what happens is to get the good stuff, you have to know somebody. You have to have an in. You have to know a politician or somebody that already has one and wants to rent, sublet it out to you. So it becomes a game of who you know rather than any ability of you to buy it yourself. So, for example, he says, the good ones never go vacant. If you don't have these connections, you get a cheap flat with cardboard walls. You have to rely on private market, which is on par with other big European cities. Rent for apartments are pretty steep, especially for newcomers because they don't qualify for social housing. Basically, what this ends up being is a subsidy for a few people that punishes anyone who is new or moving to the city. And it creates these weird externalities that I've seen with rent-controlled apartments, even the ones that I've lived in, where people that have, maybe they get a better job, maybe they have an opportunity somewhere that they cannot leave for because the subsidy they have for the rent control now makes it so that they can't, the deal is too good to leave to go anywhere else. So it kind of clamps down on normal economic movement. It clamps down on the ability for new people to flood into the city and enjoy it. It sort of stagnates. It locks you in time. Now, I think we all know, as you can say from your open source model or from this example for anything, is when you have a lot of competition, the price goes down. And I fully agree with that. And I think if this is the way you have to do it, it's better than what we're doing in the Bay Area where there's just nothing happening. Totally. But I think the negative externalities, like for a good example, is because the government is the largest landlord, they own almost all the houses in the city, they've done a pretty bad, outside of the rent being low, they've done a terrible job at it in terms of like, there's many loud, vociferous complaints about trying to get anything fixed. In fact, you generally have to factor in the cost of doing the repairs yourself because the time it takes is so long, the lag time of getting anything fixed is so long that you have to pay for it yourself. And when you add that into your rent cost, it makes it more even with other places. So my idea is like simply, whatever way you got to do it, if we're making areas zoned for, the demand is there. People want to live in these parts of the city or they want to live close to the city center at an affordable rate. Mm-hmm. People want it. If you make it so that's allowed to be built, someone will build it to take advantage of that opportunity and they will sell it. So I think their big win, the big takeaway is just the great zoning and not really so much that the government has to make and build and decide what the houses look like, where they are. We're going to run your landlord. We're going to do, I think that's the area where I feel like is overstated. And the idea that they set the rent price with rent control, again, all that is kind of a...
Well, they have, so they do, I don't know if I would call it rent control, but they have an additional policy that applies across everything as far as I understand. I forget the German phrase, but it's basically called the index adjustment, which means that landlords cannot raise prices unless they scale with inflation for the year. And then even then, there's a cap on that. So it prevents huge spikes in rent from happening over short periods of time. So that's also something that keeps prices low. I think the idea there being that it prevents somebody like a landlord from gouging you on the fact that you need to pay for this place to live in. They can't just keep scaling rents at a rate that outpaces inflation, basically.
Yeah. Okay, let's imagine that you are going to this is Aiden's desert rave. Okay, you're gonna go to a big rave party in the desert. And it's gonna be awesome. And there's gonna be a concert. And there's gonna be lights, and everyone's gonna have a good time. And everyone out there is having a good time at the rave in the desert. Okay, and someone brings a bottle of or a case of Aquafina water to sell because everyone's gonna be thirsty. It's a sweaty ass rave. And they know that no one else there is selling, so they can offer it for $10 a bottle or $20 a bottle, and it sells out. If the government comes in and says you have to only charge $2 a bottle, that's it. There's a price cap on that. You cannot raise the price. But the demand is there for $20 a bottle. Then what usually happens in real life is that they'll say, okay, they'll do it. But then, mysteriously, a crate of water falls off the truck, and now it's being sold in the black market because the demand is there. Like even if you followed the law to the letter. Some people get the $2 water in the front, then it's out, and it doesn't, you're not saving more people. The same amount of people are getting water, just a better price. So the only real way to fix it is to get more water. The only way is to have more people selling water that they're driving the price down. So when you cap the rents like that, you end up in situations like your friends talk about where The real way to get it is you have to know somebody.
Yeah.
It ends up with these weird back channel.
I said maybe maybe somebody from Austria or Vienna can chip in and clarify here. But the way it was explained to me is that the wait they're talking about avoiding is specific. They were talking about the wait time for private housing, finding private housing the normal way. They also said it can take a while. The way it broke down is with normal public housing, which sounds like it doesn't have the same restrictions that you were talking about. The public seems to be available to any EU citizen or refugee. Like
after 2 years, right?
Public. Sorry, the purely public housing is any EU citizen can apply to live in it, right?
Okay.
But the semi-public housing has a Vienna residency requirement to it. So there's a distinction between those two things. If they broke down the semi-public option is you basically apply for like a ticket. It sounds like something you apply for like way in advance if you're a Vienna resident. And then after, eventually your ticket comes up in the queue and then you're fed options, up to 3 options of flats that you could move into. And then if you veto 3 times in a row, you reset your position to the back of the queue or you reset your position back like a year.
Yeah.
And that was an example of how the semi-public stuff broke down. So it seems like there's different wait times and different systems for like how to fight through these things. I think another piece of a context here is when you're talking about knowing somebody to like get past the system. He talked about the broader problem of Austrian bureaucracy in general. He said getting things done in Austria in general is a miserable experience.
Yeah, I got that.
Getting your marriage acknowledged, for instance. He was talking about how his sister just got married and she's getting married to someone not from Austria. And they don't even live in Austria right now, but they want their marriage to be recognized by the Austrian government. And it's a huge pain in the ass. It's a very complicated process for basically no reason. And I saw a lot of complaints about that in general from just strangers online, like Austrian bureaucracy specifically. I think what you're saying is like, I think what you're saying broadly, I kind of agree with. Like I think building is important.
Yeah.
And if they weren't building more public housing units along the way, then it wouldn't make sense. But they're building a supply of public housing that is competitive with the private market over time. And those places are available to get into or apply to. That's something that does affect the market regardless.
No, it does. More housing is the biggest solution to the problem.
Yeah.
I just think there's a lot of negative a lot of annoyances that crop up when it's done this way that are still better than not building at all.
I actually think this synthesizes nice.